Welcome back everyone to Vectorworks 2014. This is the first year series of classes, episode 2 with James Russell. Anyway, a quick recap of what we did last time. We learned how to add objects together. We learned that you could also clip objects from each other, known as the cookie cutter, where the things on top cut through to the things on the bottom. And we also learned about intersecting, which is where the area that two objects share, you get a new object from that area. We might have discussed quickly also rotating here with the rotate tool, so I can do a 1, 2, 3 swing and rotate like that. And the mirror tool, another handy one over here on the left hand side. Choose a mirror plane, flip that object over and get a new object. And we also learned about distribute and move by points. That was pretty much it. After running through all of the basic shapes, that's where we left off last time. So we're going to discuss a few more things to do with the workspace, a little bit more to do with 2D, all ready for our lesson in 3D coming up next lesson. So I've got a couple of things open here. If you don't have them open, feel free to open them and I'll show you how. So I've got the attributes panel and the snapping panel right here. You can get to them from the window, palettes, and here they are here, snapping and attributes, Control Shift and Control Shift C and Control Shift A. For those of you on a Mac, that will probably be Apple Shift C and Apple Shift A. So sometimes you've got to be careful with this one. It'll often hide like this. It'll be a little tiny box, and you'll often find it lurking up here in the left hand corner, and I often miss it, and a lot of students are kind of like, where's it gone? It's just sitting there. For those of you who have pinning like me, you can pin it open if you'd like to. Now, attributes coincides hand in hand with classes and layers, which we're going to talk about soon. So we'll bear that in mind, and I'll probably come back to attributes in a second. So I've just drawn two basic shapes here, and we're going to discuss the attributes panel in detail. We've got a couple of different options here. So right up the top, we've got the fill style. So essentially, it's broken into two parts here, fill and pen. We're going to look at fill first. So fill, we can do solid, pattern, hatch, tile, gradient, load an image, or class style. We'll talk about that in a second. I've got it on solid at the moment, and I can click here in this little color preview box and choose a color if I like. Let's make this a nice red. And away we go. So you can see that fill style has changed to red there. And conversely, I can click here on the pen type, might choose a solid or a pattern, and I've got a pen color as well. We'll make that lovely green that I had stored away before, or we can make it something a little bit more, there we go, with a bit more emphasis on it. So there's the two drop down options there. You can see if I choose a pattern here, it'll probably, so a line type here of, I don't know, circles or something, blah 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 blah, all the way around. This is quite a small object comparative to the page size, so that's why it's so large. But as the object gets larger, you'll see the pattern expands around for that. It's kind of handy to know that all of that can happen. I'm going to go back to a solid line type on this, and we'll talk about the last little section. We've got opacity. This sometimes I find that it doesn't exist unless you've got Renderworks. Kind of depends on the object that you're using, but I think it's standard now in all packages. So if I overlay this object on top, or this object's on top of that one, if I reduce the opacity here to say 50%, you'll see it's 50% see-through. So the closer to 100 it is, the more present the object will be. The closer to 0, the more transparent the object will be. Crank that right back up. And we've also got a line thickness on this, so I can increase that, and you can see it's quite bold now around the edge of that shape. And I can also drop it back by doing this back to our standard 0.05. It's also got some tailing ends on it, so this is mainly if you're drawing lines and you want to put an arrowhead on either end. You can see I've got some tiny little arrowheads, or you can do dot points and things like that. Let's put a circle there. So that's good if you want to do notation or marking that points to a specific item or to an actual object. You can use the arrowheads. You'll probably learn more about this in lesson 4, lesson 5 when we talk about dimensioning things, putting annotations on the page, etc., etc. There's an important thing to note as well. A lot of people ask me this when they're jumping into 3D. They'll have drawn a series of components, and that's pretty cool. They're all filled in. And then they'll come across a whole heap of components, I'm going to set this up so I can do it, where they don't have a fill, like this. What's actually happened here is, with nothing selected, you set the defaults for that particular class that you're in, which we're in class none at the moment. So if I change this to solid and change my color to red with nothing selected, everything I draw from then will have a red fill in it. And a lot of people come across this, they'll have nothing selected and choose none. And when they get to the 3D time, all of their objects will appear blank, as they do here on my screen. And it's a real issue that you mightn't get around. The easiest way that you can do that is to get around that is to select everything, choose a solid fill, and then just choose a base color. You can see that's affected all of the objects in there, except for this little fella who's got a red line still. He's being an individual. That's the attributes panel. It's pretty straightforward. It will come back into play in just a second when we talk about classes, but up until then I want to talk about snapping because that's quite important. So we skipped over this in our first lesson, the snapping panel. The setup that I use 99% of the time is what you see here, which is off, on, off, off. We'll talk about why I use that and all the reasons behind why you might like to turn other things on in just a second. But we need something on our page, so I'm going to draw a couple of rectangles here, and we're going to talk about each of these in detail. The first one's pretty easy, and I need to zoom down a little bit. I don't know if you'll be able to see it with your resolution, but there's the blue border all the way around on this grid area, and then within that there's a series of micro dots. In my case there's 1, 2, 3, it's a 3 by 3 grid inside there. So if I turn on this snapping grid here and start drawing, I'll click here to begin with. Notice what happens as I draw. See how I lose that flexibility because I'm actually snapping. See, it snaps. I'll zoom in even closer to accentuate it. So my cursor's down here, and it's not until I reach over the halfway to the next line that it snaps out that way. The issue that a lot of people run into with snap to grid on is that they'll start drawing just like I did, and as they approach a corner they think that they've got it aligned. If I turn off snap to corners you'll really see it. So I might be like, oh yep, I landed on that. But see the difference there? That I didn't actually land as I snapped onto that because the snap grid is forcing me into a different location. Now there is a time and place for snap grid, and that's particularly if you're doing something which is very geometric in terms of standard sizes. The typical example is the Lego project that we do every year, where a Lego block is the same size no matter how you look at it. That's about the only time that we actually use this snap to grid function. Now, there's a couple other things that you need to note here, particularly if you're jumping between the imperials and metric system, and that's that probably your snap grid is actually incorrect. I'm going to turn off this dialog box. So as I double clicked on that, it brings me into the smart cursor settings, which covers this entirety of the snapping box. You can see all of these line up with all of these icons over here, apart from the general obviously, which is just some overview stuff going on. Now, I've got snap grid enabled and reference grid enabled. I actually want to change these values because they jump every time I jump from Imperial, and I'm going to make them something like this, a 1 and a 10, maybe a 5 and a 10. So my reference grid should always be larger than my snap grid ideally, because you want a breakdown of your reference grid inside your snap grid. There's a couple other options here, show the grid, print the grid, and some Z-axis stuff which we'll get onto later. And as I hit OK, you'll actually watch the blue should decrease to a size of 10, and the symmetrical grid should increase in terms of dots, and you can see them now hopefully on your screen. Dot 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 dot. So now my snapping is down to the millimeter, which might be ideal in some cases, but as I said, I prefer being able to do this freehand and then snapping to corners. That's the way that I like to work. Speaking of snapping to corners, we've got the next option here. I'm going to turn off the other snaps just so we can see all of these in action. So if I turn on snap to corners, it literally does as the name suggests, we snap to corners. If I start drawing, the moment I approach a corner, it'll snap on in there. See? Bottom right hand corner. And that applies also to bottom centers, left centers, right centers, and the center point of the object. So it covers all of those 9 perimeter areas as well as the center. And you'll notice if I have a circle, it chooses a logical point for that circle as well. So as I approach that here, I'll probably get a top center, a bottom center, and a center point. All of your shapes will, generically take on that form, even polylines as well. It will generally choose the vertexes. So as I draw this shape out here and seal the deal, if I approach any of those vertexes, I get an end point, and then a midpoint, and then an end point and midpoint, etc., etc. It won't probably give me a center, I don't think. No, not of that object. So that's something handy to note. I'm going to grab all that and delete it. And we'll turn that off for a second, and we're going to turn on snap to angle. Now, I'm going to draw out a plane here for us on screen. There we go, across and down. Now you'll notice there I got snaps horizontally and vertically. So here you can see I'm not getting any snaps. The moment that I turn on snap to angle, I do start getting those. That's the horizontal. I'll draw another one for you. There we go, vertical and horizontal coming across there. That's one of the things you'll get. Also, I'm just going to turn on my snap to corners so I can get in here, which I can't actually do because I'm not on the center line. So we'll just draw it out here. I'm going to run an angle out, and you can see I actually get a snap at 45 degrees, 30 degrees, and 30 degrees in the inverse direction. So we go from horizontal, 30, 45, 30, and back up to vertical. Now that's pretty logical, and it makes sense, but sometimes there's times when you want to turn some of those off, and some of those times you want to turn extra angles on. So by double clicking on the snap to angle, you get into here, angles from the axes, and you can actually edit inside here. So if I put a semicolon in and type in 15, I can actually put 15 degrees in there as a common angle. So you notice now, horizontal, 15, 30, 45, 30, 15, back to vertical again. Some people might ask why you want to do that. It's particularly handy if you're making things go in the round, if you want to concentrically make some objects rotate by 15 degrees and you want to do it manually. You can just set up a snap point with 15, and then when I'm done I can get rid of that. Obviously there's a whole heap of checkboxes in here relevant to the entirety of that. Here we've got our snap to intersection. Now this is a really handy one which I needed just before to do that exercise. As I approach an intersection of two or more points, I get a snap to object object. See that? As I jump in here, I've got these midpoints showing up, but as I snap to here, there we go, object object. So I know that that line has started smack bang on the center of those two lines, and then I can draw out from there, obviously, like my 45 degrees, my 30 degrees, etc. Or that might be two other objects colliding here. So if I draw two boxes over the top of each other, I can actually get a snap object to object and start drawing from the corner that they create. It's quite handy to note that occurs, and I love having it on. The Smart Points is the last of my favourite kind of series, and it's a new one, I believe, maybe 2010, 2011 onwards, so if you're using an older version, you won't quite have this feature. There is a datum that you can use to replace it in older versions. Smart Points is really handy when you need to align something to something else, so I'll give you two examples here. One, I'm going to hover over the end of this line a little bit too long, and I get that little red box happening around the edge of the line, if you can see that. Now every time that I line up to a horizontal, like so, or a vertical, I'll get an extension line coming off that object. That means that I know that I'm in line with that object whenever I'm doing this. Another great thing you can do is select two or more points at once. So I'm going to go and hover over this point here. It gives me some more vital information now. It'll give me when these 2 points have a vertical and horizontal alignment, so I could start drawing a box out like this. It'll also give me, if I join those two together again like that just by hovering, it'll give me the midpoint between the two, so I can actually start halfway and draw either way or out on a perpendicular, for example. Okay, so that's really handy. You can even do it up to 3 points. So if I want to triangulate between these 3 points, I'll get a midpoint here, and you can see I'm adapting now as I keep jumping around my midpoints by hovering too long. So you can have up to 3 at any time on a drawing. It'll just replace the oldest one first when you make a new one, and then I can see I've got my midpoint, midpoint, midpoint. Okay, really quite handy thing to have on your screen at this current point in time. Just going to get off of that. Excellent. So I've got 3 more here. They aren't my favourites, but they do work. You have a snap to distance here. You can double click on this, and it's a percentage of distance if you've got it enabled. So if I want to here, I can hover over this line, and you can see it gives me... I've got to probably turn my Smart Points off. See that little arrow marker that's about 25% of the way in? That's snap to distance. So if I hover here, I can get a snap at 25% of this line length. Also, you can see as I hover over here, there's more little arrows. 25% of the way into that midpoint, 25% of the way into that midpoint, and conversely on the other side as well. Really handy if you do need to break a line up into, say, 9 parts. It means that you can type in a distance here, a fraction. So if we wanted to do 1/9, for example, we would type 1 on 9. Hit OK. If you have a look here, that's 1/9 of the way in from the edge, and conversely on the other side as well. So that's really handy to know that you can do that. You can also type in 2/9 or a percentage, or you could do multiple divisions. So if I tick that, you can see it does a 1/9 all the way along, which is really good if I want to go, yep, break this line to 9, 1, 2, 3, etc., etc. And that's all a 1/9 all the way along. So I'm going to decheck that, and I'll take that off again. On the home stretch now, we've got Smart Edge. I'll demonstrate this. I think it's T from memory. So these lines here, if I hover over an edge of one, see it's now got this dashed effect happening. I've hovered on it for a bit too long there, and I've got my extension line, but you can also activate that with T. And essentially it just draws these edge marker lines all the way along. I don't know if there's actually a maximum to it. We'll just see here by activating it a couple of hundred times. Yeah, it looks like it's 3. Maybe even, oh, it's 3 per plane? Don't know. Anyway, it gives me edge extensions, so it's kind of like the Smart Points essentially, but with an edge version. So I can hover my line up here and do that, and then I can create another one just by pressing T. T on those, I can make a couple more, and you can find intersection smart edge right there. Quite handy if you do need to do some alignment stuff and you don't want to have your smart points activated all the time, but it will get in the way occasionally during your drawing, so just watch out for that. Lucky last, we've got snap to tangent, and I'm going to show you this with a circle on screen. So there we go, we've got a circle. Now, as I approach with this line, just coming from, let's do this direction, you can see I get object, which is me just touching the perimeter all the way around, and a couple other snaps which will turn off. So I get object all the way around when I've got this activated, the snap to object, all the way around here. But what happens when I want to know if this perfectly aligns with what we call the tangent of that circle, when it becomes perfectly flat and runs into the circle? We can actually click snap to tangent here, and notice what happens is I get two tangential points either side of the center mark. It's here, represented by a little circle, snap to tangent, and I know that that line is now entering the circle at a perfectly flat angle compared to the circle. And same on this side, if I click and we zoom in, see how it just goes perfectly flat. There's a bit of misalignment here, but as I zoom in and it recorrects itself, it's perfectly flat as it reaches that point, and that's what we call a gradient of 0 entry there. So it's all pretty awesome. Snapping, very handy. Like I said, this is my preferred layout here, mainly because it's what I use most of the time. If you have these extra ones on, particularly the snap to distance, smart edge, and the snap to tangent, you'll notice that it gets a little bit cluttered. I turn them on when I need them to be, but not all the time. So definitely watch out for this one, snap to grid. That will ruin some of your drawings, and only really use it if you need to use the snaps. The rest of these are pretty harmless in terms of what they'll actually do to the drawing itself. All very cool kind of stuff going on. Next, we've got to talk about layers and classes. And now this is a component that's tough because it spreads itself across such a broad range of this series. It's actually probably relevant to 5, maybe 6 episodes total. And I'm going to teach it to you in a series of parts, most probably 2 parts at this stage. I've clicked on the Organization tab. Now you can get to this in multiple ways. There's a little stack of paper here, which is the Layers button. There's also a little tree diagram here, which is the Classes button. You can click on either of these. They take you to the same place essentially. If you have a look here as my Organization panel opens, there's a series of tabs along the top. In the Mac version you'll see them. There's still a series of tabs across the top. It starts with Classes, through to Design Layers, Stories, Sheet Layers, Viewports, Saved Views, and References. This is actually the order that we should, in theory, set up our drawing. So we'd start with Classes and Design Layers, which we're about to talk about. And then we go into Stories, Sheet Layers, and Viewports, which are, well, Stories are a bit tied into Design Layers. Sheet Layers, Viewports, they're their own entity in their own right. And Save View and References, they're kind of end game materials in terms of the drawing, into what you might be referencing and what you're setting up for your client to view or for you to view. So they work in a very chronological order. We're going to start with Design Layers this time first, then we're going to jump back to Classes just so we can get a distinction going here. By default, you've always got 2 classes and 1 design layer. Your 2 classes will be Dimension and None. So None has its own dimensioning. That's just like your standard default layer. Whatever you set up here in your attributes panel, that's what it'll chill on. Dimensioning is slightly different, but by default it's actually the same settings. But it allows you to, say, make your dimension lines a bit thinner or something like that. Talk about that in a sec. Design layers, though, you always start off with 1, which is Design Layer 1. That's the default name. You're given one of them. It will default to a scale. Normally mine will be 1:1. Talking about that in a second. And you've got a couple other buttons here to go. Let's double click on this first. And we get this, the Edit Design Layers menu. Now, name, that's pretty simple. I'm actually going to call this one First Story. And that's setting up for what we're going to talk about with classes. The scale in here is very important, and there's been a lot of discussion in some of my videos about how we use scale. In the starting of scale, I often say 1:1 is best. This is because you're getting started, you don't really have to think about presentation yet. You need to think about actually drawing your components at a 1:1 scale. Scale never affects measurement as such, especially in the design layer. If you draw something at 100mm long, it's always 100mm long in the design space. Scale only really comes into things when you take what you make in the design world and place it onto a page. And that's where we need to start thinking about scale in terms of how we use it. So at this stage, I recommend 1:1, and then we're going to talk about why you would change it to 1:25, 1:50, 1:100 a bit later on down the track in lesson 4 or 5 when we get into presentation. In saying all of that, if you need to change it now, there's a scale button here with a multitude of options as well as custom scales. So you can go right ahead and do that. Stacking order is the next one, and it's important here, but you can actually juggle it in here, which is a bit nicer to use. Stacking order essentially says who's on top. Because we're dealing primarily with 2D layers at the moment, but later on also 3D layers, it's really important to think about which layer's on top. So when we did that center front, center back with our objects before, we were talking within their layer. They can't jump into another layer unless we tell them to do so. So we're going to leave that at 1 for now, and we're going to talk about how you juggle that in this layout a bit later on. Story inside here, we don't have any stories yet, and we're going to talk about those when we come to 3D, so that's probably best. Same as elevation, wall height, all of these things are only relevant if you're actually drawing 3D objects. Opacity, that's just how transparent the layer is overall. So if you would like to see through the layer a bit more than graying, which we'll talk about in a second, you want to drop this number down. For now, we're going to leave it at 100%. All the rest of this stuff is only relevant later on, so we'll hit OK. See, I've renamed that now to first layer, and I'm actually going to hit the new button and call my next one second story. Excellent. All of these options, hit OK. Now, my second story, as I'd expect, is on top of my first story in terms of the stacking order. Whoever's highest up towards the top is in order of stacking. So if I draw something on second story and something on first story, the thing on second story will be on top no matter what I do. You can change that by just clicking in here, this column which has the numbers in it, click and hold, and you can drag that down. So I've flicked that up, and I can drag that up there, and it will have a little think about that and move those around for me. The first 3 columns here are pretty important. Now they're shared with what we call the navigation. I'm just going to close this and pop it open in the background for us so you can see it is the same. I accidentally hit cancel on that dialog, didn't I? Let's just quickly redo that. First story. Try and spell it correctly the first time. And we're going to make a new layer in here. Second story. Excellent. Beautiful. So if we have a look, we've got this over here, visibility, and this visibility here. These are the same. They are exactly the same. So you'll notice if I make first story invisible and second story visible, talk about that in a moment, you'll notice it updates here as well. So in that navigation, we've got 3 columns. Visible, and anyone who uses Photoshop or Illustrator is just like, I've got this. Visible, invisible is the second column, and then we've got grade mode, which is a semi-translucent mode. It kind of lets you see through some things, lets you not. It depends on how you've got it set up, but we're going to do both of these visible just for the time being. There's also a 4th column here, which is a little tick. That's whichever layer is active at the time. So I'm going to make first story active, and that means that things that I draw at the moment are going to be on first story. So let's start out by making our first story the way that I want it to be. I'm going to set up a little house here. We're going to say it's quite small. It's going to be 8 by 4. I'm just going to plonk a rectangle down here. There we go. And for the time being, I'm just going to draw some walls around that. I'm going to use the cheeky wall tool, which you guys don't know about yet. Bam, 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 bam. There we go. Okay, I've made a few walls around the edge of that. Now what I'm going to do is draw a little bit of furniture inside here. We'll do a little table, and we might put a few temporary chairs in, which are going to look fabulous. Yep, there's one over there, and we'll just rotate and copy that. Pressing U, I can change the mode. Yep, yep, and yep. Excellent. Okay, that's a nice little table, and let's also have a bed over here on the side with a couple of pillows. There we go. Excellent. So we'll say that that's our room for now. It's quite a basic room, there's no doubt about that. But I'm going to use our room to show us the difference between layers and classes, okay? And the thing that I want to really push here is that layers by definition are different heights of things. That's how I view them. So in this particular example, we've got our first story which has all of this on it, and I'm actually going to select all of this and copy it temporarily to make a point. And I'm going to jump to my second story. I've done it from the drop down here. You could have clicked a box here, you could have held down control and pressed the up or down keys, and I'm going to paste all of that in place so it all lands on top. I'll actually delete probably the middle entirety of it. So now we've got 2 stories, the first story and the second story. Now this could be anything. It could be stage and lighting layer, it could be set 1 and set 2, it could be anything. It's just a division between very separate things that you might want to turn on or turn off later on down the track. What I want to go back here to is the first story though, and I want to use classes to do a little bit more of a breakup. Classes are particularly useful for making categories of things. So in this particular drawing we've got a few categories that I want to look at. I'm going to select these chairs, and I'm going to make a new class for them, which is going to be called, believe it or not, chairs. So let's do chairs in here. Hit OK, and ask me for a few options here. So I've got a user creation option, I've got some fill and some pen stylings, and a whole heap of texture options down the bottom. I'm going to hit OK for now, and OK again. Now, just because I've made that class doesn't mean we're on it yet. So over here on class, in my object info, I can actually, from the drop down list, select chairs. Nothing looks like it's happened, and that's OK, that's fine. I'm also going to do the same for a table, so let's do that. Yep, that's excellent, and I'm going to make one for bed. So I'm literally just making categories of objects, and we'll talk about why I'm doing this after I've associated all of this. So I'll grab all of that, pop that onto my bed layer, and I'm going to make a table here as well. Excellent. Now, in saying all of that, if I go to the second story, instead of having to go through and allocate everything like that, I can actually choose a class to be on. Let's draw another table here. And as I draw this object in, like so, you can see it's automatically picked up the class of table, and I could jump onto my chair class, and I could draw maybe some circular chairs around this table this time. Super. All of those are now known as chairs as a category. Now, you might be thinking, what's the advantage of this? Well, initially, straight off the bat, if I go back here to my first story, and I'm going to turn off the second story, I can start eliminating objects from this via class. So if I'm on the none class here, and I turn off chairs, they disappear. Turn off a bed, disappears. Turn off the table, disappears. All of these things are just controllable. So not only can I turn on or off the first story as an entirety, I can turn on or off classes as well, which gives me that breakdown that I'd really like. Classes have another really handy function. Watch this. If I go up here to my chairs layer, and I tick this box which is user creation, I can actually set up so that the chairs or tables or anything else that I draw in that class has a particular styling. In this case I'm going to make the fill style red, and it should pop up with the dialog box that says, you already have objects on this class, would you like to use the class attribute for this? And I'm going to click yes to all. Now all of the chairs that I've ever drawn have a red fill to them, not only here on the first story but also on the second story. This is really handy if a designer ever comes to you and says, man, I really like what you've done with this. You've arranged all of these 55 flats that I've asked for perfectly. I would just like the wallpaper to be a different colour. Now, instead of having to go through and change the wallpaper for every single flat, all I need to do is go to my classes menu, double click here on chairs, and I can select a different shade of red. Perhaps you want it a bit darker. Hit OK, OK. And they have all changed to a different styling. Okay, so it's really important that you get that distinction happening, and right from the start of your drawing set up some of the classes, even if they're not as general as the category that you'd like. At least putting things into a class as opposed to the none layer can really help your drawing later on down the track. That's a really important point to stress, and it gives you a lot more flexibility in terms of turning things on, turning things off as a subcategory, as you can see here. Hopefully that's made a bit of sense to you all, and like I said, we will be recapping this about lesson 4 or 5 when we come into presentation styles, so that's really important to note. This is pretty much the end of lesson 2, where we talk about advanced 2D objects and how they can be laid out in the space. Our next lesson, lesson 3, goes into 3D elements and how they can be used in the space, particularly starting to take 2D objects and take them to the next level of 3D. But before you go there, there is an exercise that I normally like to run, which is called everyday objects, and that's where you find something that you use every day in your kitchen or in and around your home, at your desk perhaps, and you attempt to draw that at scale. That's going to be what I'll leave you with today, and I'd really like to see some results. So if you do follow along with this online, it'd be great to see some of your creations, even if you want to submit them as a little mini video or a picture, and I'll try and feature them in the upcoming lessons. So that'd be great to see if you do manage to pull that off. Apart from that, as always, if you would like to donate to the channel, it'll be in the description box below, as well as the previous episode, and stay tuned for next week's episode when we look into the great world of 3D. I'm James Russell, and I will see you next time.